and we move from 40 times to something a little faster, the start to the F1 season. The circuit's going to be in Bahrain for the start of the 2024 season, and to talk about it, David Cushnan, our head of content out of London for Leaders in Sport, and based here in Charlotte, Adam Stern, our motorsports writer. Guys, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Cheers, Austin.
Thank you.
You know, the first thing I want to talk about, Netflix Drive to Survive Season 6 just dropped. It's obviously a review of the 2023 season. I've checked out a lot of the episodes, and I got to say, they seem like there was a lot of manufactured drama just because Max Verstappen was so dominant last season. But, you know, David, I want to go to you first. Looking back at previous seasons, and you can also reflect on what you've seen so far this season, what has been the response to the show in Europe? Obviously, F1 was already incredibly popular on the continent, but what has it done for the series there?
Well, I've seen 3 or 4 episodes of the new series, and I think, roughly speaking, it is same again. I think it's always been a little bit manufactured, and the drama has been hyped up, and certain situations have been slightly contrived to fit the storyline, but I guess that's the Netflix prerogative. Newer fans probably don't mind that or don't know about some of that. Some of the more hardened fans do find that a little bit frustrating, but nonetheless, it's always nice to have a little glimpse, even for the hardened, experienced F1 fan, into the inner workings of the paddock and hearing those little snippets, whether it's drivers or team principals or some of the other characters around the series. So more of the same in that respect. In terms of what it's done in Europe, I think certainly it has switched on Formula One for a lot of people who maybe previously didn't know much about it, certainly didn't pay it much attention. And there's a definite cool factor almost about Formula One. It's become a little bit more part of the popular culture over the past few years. I know the same is true in the US, but there's definitely a new wave, a new generation of fans that have come out of the Drive to Survive era, if you like. I think a couple of reasons for that, and a couple of reasons why some of the impact has been a bit exaggerated. F1 was obviously first out of the blocks with this type of documentary. A lot of other sports have been copying it, as we all know, in the years since it was first released. I think the fact that it was just gathering steam as a series when COVID hit and there was no other live sport to watch was a real big factor in its success. And equally, that incredible, almost once-in-a-generation championship battle that we saw in 2021 between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, with that remarkable, unbelievable finish, really, I think, helped. So, I think it's been overall a big positive, even if perhaps some of the success and the power of the series has maybe been a touch overstated.
Adam, would you agree that it still has that cool factor, the show here in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at what the show has done so far this season, according to Flix Patrol, a streaming data site, in 70 countries around the world, roughly, it's made the top 10 so far, and the average ranking is number 4. And those are obviously countries all over the world, pretty much every continent you can think of. So, look, from a macro perspective, this show continues to do well. It continues to do what Liberty Media originally had in mind, which is try and spread this sport around, create drama off the track, because there's not always drama on the track, and it continues to do that. So from a really large perspective, I think the show continues to do well. You can see it in the numbers. Kind of digging down a little bit more into the details, as you guys have mentioned, there are some things to nitpick a little bit. There's still, it seems like, a little bit of manufactured drama to a degree. There's even some things that were a little bit off this season, where at one point they showed a pre-race grid shot of a F2 race, and they were trying to make it look like it was an F1 race. So some things like that, where they're just misaligning production shots. And obviously in the past, they've kind of been accused of manufacturing drama, even with like driver radios at times when they were saying things that weren't really matching up with what the viewer was seeing. It seems like they've kind of gone a little bit away from that and gone more towards accuracy, but there was definitely still some complaints this year. So look, I mean, as you guys have mentioned, last season for F1 was, however you want to put it, either was kind of the most dominant season ever by a driver, or some people would say it was just a very boring season as a result. Of course, F1 has a lot of drama off the track. We just saw, for example, Lewis Hamilton's going to Ferrari next year. Christian Horner, unfortunately for himself, is embroiled in a big drama that could see him potentially lose his job that everyone's keeping on. So F1 has always been a series that has a lot of action off the track, and this show has done a good job highlighting it. As you guys have mentioned, it was very much so benefited by COVID and how everyone was stuck at home. But the big thing watching out for now is Drive to Survive going to be enough? We saw F1 plateau a little bit last year in the US with its ratings because Max Verstappen was dominating so much. So, we know that there's the big Brad Pitt movie coming out next year with Apple Films, things like that. But it will be really interesting to keep an eye on whether F1 has started to plateau here or whether things like Drive to Survive can still keep the growth going.
They didn't talk about, obviously, in this current season, anything with Lewis Hamilton leaving or anything having to do, like you said, with the management at Red Bull. They did talk a little bit about one of the show's biggest stars, Gunther Steiner, being out at Haas. That was at the end of the series, foreshadowing that he's probably not going to be a part of season 7 if that happens, unless they bring him in as one of the voices to talk about the series. One of the new additions I did like was they added Danica Patrick. Obviously has more appeal in the United States. Her career in NASCAR, in IndyCar, incredibly well known. So that was an interesting addition. Adam, you talked about the numbers last season. They were down a little bit from 2022. Still the second best season for ESPN for F1. On U.S. airwaves. But that's another rights deal that's going to be coming up. And something that we've written about a lot is how much money is there in the ecosystem for, middle of the road properties like this. And in the US, that's what F1 is. Are there going to be dollars for F1 as those rights come up again?
I think based off of what I've heard, what we've spoken with experts, it's possible they could get a small increase, but to get the sort of increase they got last time, which was more than tenfold, absolutely no chance. They got that, not only just around the time when things were the market was tightening up, media companies started pushing more for profitability, and cord cutting accelerated. Not only did that all happen, just after F1 locked in its last 3-year deal with ESPN, but they got a massive increase from ESPN and their ratings haven't grown that much since then. They really grew from 2020 to 2023, and their 3-year deal with ESPN 2023, 2024, and 2025, ever since then, of course, last season, their ratings have plateaued a little bit. So you add it all up, and it's probably going to be tough for them to get a really big increase. But obviously, one thing to keep an eye on is there's been rumors, not necessarily super well substantiated, but there have been some rumors thrown out there over the last 6 months that Apple could look to do a streaming deal across the entire globe with F1. And so that would obviously be fascinating if something like that happened. It is something to keep an eye on, but we'll have to just see if it happens.
They're also involved in that Brad Pitt movie you spoke about, correct, Apple?
Absolutely, yeah, they're shooting that. So, Tim Cook has been at races, and they're showing a major interest in racing. So from that regard, you can't rule it out.
Now, David, what else could possibly help F1 appeal to U.S. fans? You have Haas, that was like an American-backed team. Then you had Sargent, the first U.S. driver in a while, coming to the series next year. But I don't think either of those are going to move the needle. Whereas something like Andretti joining the sport, something that is synonymous in the U.S. in motorsports, maybe could have helped move the needle a little bit. Is that something that F1 is missing out on?
It's always been said that if you can get a front-running driver of a particular nationality, that is a real booster for the sport in that country. And you look at Max Verstappen, his success, okay, very small country, the Netherlands, but they have, off the back of his success, ended up hosting a race, which seemed a difficult thing to have imagined a few years earlier. From a US point of view, certainly a front-running driver, I think we're a way off that still, would be a big marker moment and probably have an impact in terms of viewership, because there's nothing like getting behind a national hero, especially one competing on a truly global platform. I think the team thing is interesting. The Haas team is a US-owned team. It operates sort of half out of the US, half out of Europe. It's not necessarily pitched itself as the American national team in the way that we might have imagined when it first came into F1 in 2016. Andretti's potential entry or bid to enter the sport was rejected out of hand by F1 over the winter. There was a very detailed response from F1 as to why it wasn't the right moment to allow an 11th team, an expansion franchise, if you like, into the sport, because that's effectively what the sport is becoming, a sort of franchise model. Clearly, you could boil that big long list of explanations down to the fact that the 10 existing teams didn't want to split their revenues with an 11th team, with a newcomer. But I think it would have been wise for F1 to give that entry, or in fact give any new entry, a bit more consideration. I think there's always, history shows that in F1, even when you think that teams are solid and manufacturer interest is strong, there is a track record of manufacturers coming and going, at very short notice. And I think it's always wise to have some new entrants waiting in the wings. Even better if that new entrant is, as you said, a storied name from the United States, the market for F1 in terms of expansion. And I think it really felt like the right moment to give the green light to that. But for the reasons that we've sort of explained, doesn't seem like it's happening at the moment. I think there is a route still for the Andretti name to get into F1. I think it's probably ultimately going to be through buying into an existing team. And I think there's possibly a couple of options for that over the next 2-3 years. But I think that's going to be the only way. But yes, it would have a big impact, I think, on F1's popularity in the States.
Adam, we'll give you the last word. What do you think about Andretti?
Let's start with this, David and Austin. The most important thing is they got to get their competition better. Okay, the Super Bowl is not the Super Bowl if there's a giant blowout every single year. Part of the reason people love the NFL and the Super Bowl is what it is because football is so exciting. We saw this year the game came down to overtime. 2021 for Formula One, right off the back of the Drive to Survive effect, starting in 2020 when people were stuck at home, was a perfect storm, amazing timing, but they haven't been able to repeat it since. And that's the first problem they have with their plateauing ratings. Would having Logan Sargent competing help? Absolutely. Would getting Andretti in help? Absolutely. But they have to have an exciting sport. I think people all around the world want to be entertained, but in America, I can assure you, people absolutely want to be entertained, and maybe even a little bit more demanding of it than some other markets. So that's been a huge problem for them, and they got to get that right. And there's huge concerns coming out of F1 that this is going to be another Red Bull blowout season. And that would be devastating for F1. But to get Andretti in would help. I think David's exactly right. They could potentially buy their way in still. We'll see what happens there. Or they could try and wait it out till 2028 when General Motors can fully produce an engine. But they got to get their competition right.
It's not necessarily just this season, as you say. It seems very likely, all the indications are this could be another season of dominance from Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing, and hats off to them because it's sporting excellence at the highest level, but it's not great for the product at a time when the product is critical for F1. And I do think there's an interesting moment. F1 has swept up these new fans through Drive to Survive. Can those new fans sustain, not necessarily just this season, but next season as well, before the big set of rule changes happening in 2026, which does have the potential genuinely to shake up the order again and will be a really interesting moment for the reorganization of the pack? Can F1 keep all these new fans, and will those new fans be satisfied and be able to sustain something they've not seen before, but something that is very common in F1 over the years, which is these periods of dominance by one car and one driver? And I think that's something that Stefano Domenicali and his team at F1 are going to be keeping a really close eye on, all the data, all the metrics this season and next.
Well, a number of issues to pay attention to for F1 as the season begins on Sunday. Adam Stern, our motorsports writer based here in Charlotte. David Cushion, our head of content for Leaders in Sport, who's going to be stateside at our Force event in Manhattan, May 21st through 22nd. Looking forward to seeing you there, David. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Good stuff. Cheers, Adam.
Thanks.